All right, so you know why you're here, right? You're listening to the deep dive because you want to know what's actually going on in the world. You're busy. You don't have time to read every article and every report.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing for you today. We're diving deep into something that's super important, these U.S.-led talks in Riyadh about the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, exactly. We've been going through all the information from the White House, the AP, Reuters, NBC News, all that stuff from around March 25th, 2025, trying to figure out what's really happening with this whole de-escalation thing, especially in the Black Sea, and this idea of stopping attacks on energy facilities, which has been a big deal lately.
And our goal today is pretty straightforward. We're going to break down the main agreements that came out of these talks in Riyadh. We'll look at what Ukraine, Russia, and the U.S. are each saying, and we'll try to understand what all this could mean for the future. Think of this as your crash course on a really big development.
So to really get a handle on these talks in Riyadh, we have to go back a bit and look at what happened before, like what led up to them. It looks like President Trump himself was really involved in getting some high-level discussions going.
Yeah, that's right. Before these expert groups even met, President Trump apparently had separate phone calls with both President Zelensky and President Putin. And it seems like some of the ideas they talked about then became part of the agenda in Riyadh.
One of the big things they discussed was possibly agreeing to stop attacking energy facilities, and that ended up being a major part of what they talked about and apparently agreed on in Riyadh. They also mentioned a 30-day ceasefire, but it doesn't seem like President Putin was totally on board with that idea.
What's interesting here is that this might show a change in how the U.S. is dealing with the situation under President Trump. It seems like they're moving away from that really strong, full-on support for Ukraine that we saw before and trying to be a bit more neutral, trying to find some kind of common ground with Russia. And, those kinds of shifts don't just happen out of nowhere.
Right, exactly. What we're hearing is that this possible change is making people in Kyiv and some of Ukraine's allies in Europe a bit nervous. They're worried that rushing to find a solution might not be good for Ukraine in the long run. They might have to give up too much to Russia. It makes you wonder, is this a smart way to de-escalate things, or is it weakening Ukraine's position?
Okay, so keeping that in mind, let's fast forward to last week, March 23rd to 25th, to those talks in Riyadh. Why did they choose Saudi Arabia as the place to meet?
Well, Saudi Arabia, led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, offered to host and help with the talks. It's pretty interesting to see them taking on this kind of role as a mediator in such a big conflict. It could mean they're trying to become more important on the world stage.
And just to be clear, these weren't direct negotiations where Ukrainian and Russian officials were sitting across from each other. The way it worked was a little different.
That's right. It was all done bilaterally with technical experts. So U.S. experts talked to the Ukrainian delegation separately, and then they had separate talks with the Russian delegation. There were no face-to-face talks between Ukraine and Russia, at least not this time in Riyadh.
Got it. So after these separate meetings, the White House put out information about the agreements they reached with both Ukraine and Russia. Let's take a closer look at what these Riyadh agreements actually say, starting with the Black Sea, which is a big deal.
According to the White House statements, it seems like they all agree on a few important things for the Black Sea. They're committed to making sure all ships can travel safely. They agreed not to use force in the area, and they promised not to use commercial ships for military purposes.
That focus on safe navigation is really interesting. It reminds me of something they tried before to keep things stable in that important waterway.
What's cool here is that it's very similar to the Black Sea Grain Initiative from 2022. That was a UN deal that allowed grain to be shipped out of the region before Russia pulled out in 2023. This new agreement could be a way to bring that kind of arrangement back, which would be huge for making sure there's enough food in the world.
And what about the attacks on energy facilities, which has been a really sensitive issue? Both sides have been going after each other's energy infrastructure, and it's having a big impact on civilians.
Apparently, both Ukraine and Russia have agreed to work on concrete ways to stop attacking each other's energy facilities. Like we said, this came from those earlier conversations between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. It's funny, though, the wording was a bit different at first. The White House talked about energy and infrastructure, while the Kremlin seemed to focus more specifically on energy infrastructure. We'll have to see if that little difference actually changes anything when they put this into practice.
If they really stick to this agreement, it could make a huge difference for people on both sides who are struggling because of the attacks on energy infrastructure. It shows they might both be interested in making sure basic services don't completely break down.
Besides the Black Sea and energy, they also talked about some important humanitarian stuff. Both sides said they're still committed to exchanging prisoners of war, releasing civilians who are being held, and getting those Ukrainian children who were taken away back home.
That's good news amongst all the conflict. Shows they're thinking about the human cost of all this. Now, there's also something about the U.S. offering to help Russia get back into global markets. What's that all about?
Yeah, when they were talking to Russia, the U.S. said they'd be willing to help Russia sell its agricultural products and fertilizers on the world market again. This would mean trying to reduce the cost of shipping assurance and make it easier for them to use ports and international payment systems. But the Kremlin said this would probably require lifting some of the sanctions that are currently in place on Russia. So it raises an interesting question. Is the U.S. strategically offering this as a way to encourage Russia to cooperate on other things?
So we have these agreements as laid out by the White House.
Right.
But what's the reaction been like from Ukraine and Russia? Are they happy with these developments?
From what we've seen so far, especially from Ukraine, there's a lot of caution. President Zelensky has been pretty skeptical publicly about whether Russia will actually follow through on these agreements. He pointed to times when Russia broke promises before.
Yeah.
And he brought up that recent Russian missile strike on Sumy, where over 100 people were injured, including a lot of kids, as a reminder that the fighting is still going on and there's a serious lack of trust.
It's understandable why Zelensky is doubtful, given the history of broken agreements and the fact that the attacks are continuing. He also talked about what Ukraine would do if Russia violates these new terms, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He said, if Russia breaks these agreements, Ukraine will ask the United States for more sanctions and more weapons. And their defense minister, Rustem Umerov, made it clear that any Russian military ships moving outside of the eastern part of the Black Sea would be seen as breaking the deal. This shows how careful Ukraine is being and how much they rely on outside help to make sure Russia follows the rules.
So a clear message of distrust and a demand for Russia to be held accountable from Kyiv. How about Moscow? What are they saying about the talks in Riyadh?
Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, said they're open to bringing back the Black Sea grain deal. But he said they need clear guarantees from Washington. Basically, they want the U.S. to make sure Ukraine does what it's supposed to prove it. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was more careful. He said they're still looking at the results of the talks. He mentioned that they might talk more, but he didn't seem too keen on setting up more talks right away or having a call between Presidents Trump and Putin. He even said a three-way meeting isn't happening anytime soon.
We also heard from a Russian lawmaker who was actually at the talks in Riyadh. What was his take on things?
Grigory Kherson, the lawmaker, said the talks were very interesting, difficult, but quite constructive, which sounds a bit more positive than what Lavrov and Peskov said. But then the Russian Defense Ministry came out and accused Ukraine of continuing to attack Russian civilian energy infrastructure with drones. They even said President Zelensky can't be trusted to stick to agreements. So even though they make agreements, there's still a lot of finger-pointing and mistrust.
So we've got a whole range of reactions, from cautious acceptance to flat-out suspicion and blame. What's the message from Washington about these agreements?
The U.S. is really emphasizing how committed President Trump is to stopping the violence on both sides and how they helped make these talks happen. They also thanked Saudi Arabia for hosting the talks. The overall message seems to be that these agreements are the most progress so far towards a wider ceasefire and a big step toward future peace talks. They're trying to show everyone that this is a positive development.
That's certainly the optimistic spin from the U.S. But while all this diplomacy was going on, the fighting on the ground didn't actually stop. That's something we can't ignore.
Definitely. Reports show that cross-border strikes are still happening. Ukraine said Russia launched a missile attack on Sumy, and their Air Force said Russia launched a huge drone attack on several regions. At the same time, Russia said Ukraine is attacking their energy facilities with drones. The fact that the fighting is continuing shows how unstable the situation is and how big the gap is between what they agreed to and what's actually happening on the battlefield.
This fact that the violence is still going on really highlights how much both Ukraine and Russia doubt that the other will actually stick to these new agreements.
Exactly. And it also shows that some really important challenges haven't been dealt with yet. Russia and Ukraine still aren't talking directly. And these agreements don't address some of the fundamental issues that are causing the conflict, like what kind of long-term security guarantees Ukraine will get, or what will happen to the parts of Ukraine that Russia is currently occupying, which is a pretty big chunk of the country.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's boil down the key takeaways for you, our listener. What are the most important things to remember about these Riyadh talks?
Well, first off, they agreed on some specific things, even though we're limited. They want to make the Black Sea safer, they're going to try to stop attacking energy infrastructure, and they're going to keep working on humanitarian issues like prisoner exchanges and getting those kids back home. And we talked about how the U.S. offered to help Russia get back into the world market for agricultural products and fertilizers, which might be a way to encourage them to cooperate.
But we also have to remember that both Ukraine and Russia are really unsure about whether these agreements will actually work. And it seems like they both expect the U.S. to play a big part in making sure everyone does what they're supposed to.
Right. While the U.S. is saying this could be the first step toward less fighting and maybe even peace talks in the future, the situation is still really fragile. The fact that the fighting is still going on and the deep mistrust between everyone involved are big obstacles to finding a real, lasting solution.
So here's a final thought for you. Given how little trust there is between Ukraine and Russia, and the fact that they're still fighting even after making these agreements, how likely do you think it is that these deals will hold up? And thinking beyond what the U.S. is doing now, what else might need to happen to achieve a real lasting peace in the region? It's a complicated situation with no easy answers. But understanding all these details is important. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.